Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Red Star. It's a new left wing podcast, which is hosted by Pavel Vargan, Ziad Faisal, and myself. Pavel is a member of the Secretariat of the Progressive International. He is also a great friend of revolutionaries across the world, particularly in the global south. He's also the force behind today's panel discussion, but he wasn't feeling well, so unfortunately could not join us. Ziad Faisal is an academic and activist from Pakistan. And my name is Amar Ali Jan. I'm a historian, activist, and member of the Hukuk-e-Khalq Party in Pakistan, the People's Rights Party. Red Star is hosted on the channel of Dr. Taimur Rahman, who is the General Secretary of the Mazdoor Kisan Party, the Workers' and Peasants' Party. It's a fraternal party of ours. We also do an Urdu show, The Red Room, on his Urdu channel, if you speak Urdu or Hindi, to discuss regional politics. Well, today we're having this discussion at a very, very interesting point in time. The liberal order, so-called liberal order, is collapsing across the Western world. You're seeing the rise of far-right movements, not only across continental Europe, in Germany, in Italy, but also in the Anglo-Saxon world, with Trump's recent victory in the US, and the rising popularity of right-wing groups in the UK. I mean, Starmer won these elections 6 months ago and is already on his way to becoming one of the most unpopular British prime ministers. Also, we're seeing new kinds of trade wars. We're seeing a lot of infighting between Western powers. Not to mention, we are witnessing a televised genocide in Gaza and regime change operations across the third world. And this is important to remember, that the so-called liberal order was always a form of counter-revolution for the global south, even after 1945. It was a counter-revolution against the anti-colonial movements in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, whether it was a Vietnam War, the Korean War, the massacres in Indonesia, the military dictatorships in so many countries, including my country, Pakistan, where the US constantly backed military dictators. So this was always an order that was premised upon the repression of the revolutionary desires of freedom of people of the global south. But now chickens are coming home to roost, and you have a collapsing liberal order within the Western world as well. So today, at this particular juncture, we want to have a discussion on war, imperialism, and the tasks of the left. And we have a fantastic panel with us to have this discussion. And I'll introduce them one by one. First of all, we have Dr. Radhika Desai, who's a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba in Canada. She's the director of Geopolitical Economy Research Group, convener of the International Manifesto Group, and past president of the Society for Socialist Studies. Then we have with us Dr. Max Ajl, who's a senior fellow at the University of Ghent and an associated researcher at the Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and Environment. He also has a book, A People's Green New Deal, which was published in 2021. And then we have with us Comrade Joti Brar, who is a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, the vice chairperson of the party, and a leader of the Anti-Imperialist League. And today we're going to be discussing what this current situation with rising far-right movements in the Western world, the fear of the rise of the global south, including the rise of China, the absolute destruction and excessive violence that we're seeing in Gaza and across the Middle East. How do we make sense of all of this in terms of politics, in terms of economics, in terms of military strategies of imperialism? But most importantly, also think about what are the alternative paths that the left can take in terms of not only building a politics in the here and now, but also setting certain horizons for ourselves. So I'll start with you, Radhika. It's the discussion these days is on turning the country where you're based, Canada, into the 51st state of the U.S. or imposing tariffs on Canada. Trump is also talking about raising tariffs on Chinese products. It almost feels like if Lenin was listening to Trump talk about potentially invading Greenland or making Canada 51st state of the United States, he would have written another book, Declining Imperialism, the comic stage of capitalism. It almost sounds like we're in the comic version of things here. How do you make sense of all of this from a political economy perspective?
Yeah, so thanks first of all, and it's wonderful to be part of this new and I think excellent initiative. So you asked me, what are we to make of Trump and his threats and so on. And interestingly, I've just written a piece about it, which will appear in Frontline, the Indian magazine Frontline tomorrow. But so I'll speak to some extent from it, but I will also extemporize because since I wrote this piece, which is only a day or two ago, things have already moved on. So let me just begin by saying that, of course, yes, Trump has been sort of throwing his threats about, I'm going to take Greenland and Panama Canal and make Canada the 51st state and impose tariffs and so on. And it's also the case that a lot of people are worried, when they look at the appointments that Trump has been making to his 4,000 plus positions on which he can make appointments. We are seeing that they consist of far more loyalists than you might imagine, than was the case last time around in 2016. And people are saying that, back then there was still a Republican Party establishment, which Trump would have had to humor. So this time around, he has a freer hand than before. Is he going to carry out these threats and so on? And, having, like I said, what has happened in the last couple of days, even. So Giorgia Meloni, I read in the newspapers, is trying to pacify European leaders who are getting really hot under the collar about the threats about Greenland, which is a Danish territory, etc., etc. We are told that, this is just a way of dealing with China. So who knows? I mean, exactly how does one interpret these threats? Will Trump carry them out? And I'm sure Trump absolutely loves the attention he's getting. But in my view, I would say that what's going to happen over the next weeks, months, and 4 years is something that really is not completely in Trump's hands. And that's part of the reason why Trump does not have a clearly defined program. There is no real, some people say he subscribes to Project 2024 or whatever it's called, and this ultra right plan, and then he had himself denied it. Now he's coming out with these completely unprecedented threats. And some people are saying that, Trump is freer to carry them out. But in my view, I really don't think that Trump is an actor. I mean, of course, he's an actor, but he's not an actor on the historical stage. I think Trump is more a symptom of the deepening malaise of US society, which, in my own analysis, which I have developed over many works, including 2 books, is actually a result of the US attempt to try to impose its will on the world, which paradoxically is undermining the US's own economy, its own power, in ways that are actually making it more difficult to allow Trump to achieve his aim. So, what are the main factors that will determine what Trump will do? So, obviously, the first of these factors is the electoral rhetoric that he has had to engage in order to win power. And that electoral rhetoric doesn't come from nowhere. It doesn't come entirely from Trump's imagination. It comes from the difficulties of justifying neoliberalism to an electorate that has suffered from 4.5 decades of it. And every year, every week practically that passes is making it worse. So how do you justify neoliberalism to that electorate? So basically, what Trump has decided is that the old methods in which basically both the both the right of center parties and the left of center parties basically coalesced into a single strategy in which they were going to justify neoliberalism by alleviating it a little bit with social liberalism, in which you claim to combat misogyny and racism by putting one or two women and non-white people in power, and then saying, voila, you see, we have solved these problems, while the vast majority of women, non-white people, and all sorts of other minorities remain exactly where they are, or actually their position deteriorates. So Trump knew that you can't not acknowledge these miseries. So he acknowledges the misery, but he does it in a partial way. And he says and he misdirects them. So he says, your misery is not because of neoliberal policies, or he doesn't even name them. He says, your misery is because of China. And your misery is because of immigrants. And it's not surprising that, of course, tariffs and deportations are the two main threats he's made. This is before he started making all these threats about acquiring territory, which I'll come to in a minute. So that's the first factor. This is rhetoric he's had to engage in order to get where he is. But of course, once he's there, there's a couple of other factors that are going to take over. So there is this, faction of the capitalist class that has backed Trump unapologetically. Elon Musk being one of them, but there are many others. People like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, many. If you look at the list of his donors, there are quite a few. So these people, they are essentially hyper neoliberals or hyper capitalists. They have been the beneficiaries of 4.5 decades of neoliberalism, but they want more. They want even lower taxes. They want even less regulation. They want even less democracy. And they're very happy to load the blame on immigrants and say that the real problem is still the government, which is over-regulating and so on. And then, so that's one faction of the capitalist class. There's said to be another faction which has backed Harris, used to back Biden, that they are somehow more at home with the existing degree of regulation, the existing degree of taxation, and the existing degree of democracy. I'm not so sure. Because, some people say that there's practically a civil war among them. But in reality, I'm not so sure that there is. I mean, it's true that some of them are really weird. They think that, they are going to essentially transform the United States into some kind of privately owned territory and so on. Again, we can come back to that. But the point is that they are essentially sort of even more neoliberal and anti-democratic. But the others are not that different. Already we know that many of the people who backed Trump also backed Harris to some extent, and vice versa, because the American capitalist class places bets on both sides. Plus, many of them who may have been particularly wary of Trump, perhaps because they have, interests in China, or Trump has targeted them like Meta and so on, they will also come around to Trump. Because have you ever met a CEO, capitalist CEO, who does not want lower taxes, who does not want lower regulation, who does not want less democracy? I mean, and some of these people are really weird. Like, they are outright, Peter Thiel has been quoted as saying that there's too much democracy. Now, obviously, he's not the first. Back in the early 70s, you had the Trilateral Commission saying that there was too much democracy. So we've seen this script before, but it's being played out to a greater extent. So these two sets of capitalists are going to be another two factors. But I think the most important factor that will govern what really happens to Trump is really the limits of US power. And those limits, and this is where, you said that we should be talking about imperialism. And I've argued for a long time that it's very important to understand that the peak of imperialism was reached in 1914. That's 111 years ago. And it has been declining since then. Now, obviously, it hasn't been declining as fast as you and I would like. Obviously, there have been reverses, like the 80s in particular, and the 90s as well, saw an enormous increase in the power of the core imperialist countries. But that did not last long, and we are once again seeing the reversal. And again, just to say one other thing about it is that we think of anti-imperialism very often in the form of wars. The Vietnam War, the current struggle in Palestine, the axis of resistance, etc. All of these are, of course, critically important. These wars have to be fought in order to gain the space for what's really needed to roll back the power of imperialism, which is development. You need to create development, because to me, imperialism is the denial of development, and anti-imperialism is the pursuit, the successful pursuit of development. So now, and precisely because China, and to a lesser extent a whole host of other countries, have been considerably successful in achieving not magnificent development. They haven't achieved US levels of living, but quite frankly, I'm not sure we need US levels of living, and the planet can tolerate US levels of living. But nevertheless, they have achieved enough productive power, enough popular legitimacy, and enough military and other forms of power to deter the United States from being, shall we say, militarily overwhelmingly powerful. So let me just go through what are the main limits of US power, and I take them to be about three different forms. Number one, I would say that the third world in general, or shall we say the world majority, which is the name that the US has given to the majority of the world, the countries and people who have not participated in sanctions. Russian intellectuals have started calling them the world majority. This world majority has become much more assertive in terms of what it demands, in terms of economic it demands from world economic governance, what it demands from the world militarily, diplomatically, etc., in terms of trade and development and so on. And this increasing assertiveness is not in small way backed by the fact that China is the most important new player in this field. China is today the most important economic partner, trade partner to the overwhelming majority of countries in the world. And so that means that the United States cannot have its say. The US can threaten whatever it likes, but the countries concerned have an alternative. It's a bit like back in the 50s, when the Americans wouldn't fund the Aswan Dam, Nasser turned to Soviets. So this kind of alternative once again exists. Secondly, I would say that the US's own allies are in deep trouble because, on the one hand, the Biden administration hit a sweet spot because so many governments in European capitals and more generally Western capitals were essentially governments that were happy to do the bidding of the Biden administration. But guess what's the result of it? Nearly all of them are having to pay the price electorally of this subservience to Biden. So Olaf Scholz's government collapsed within hours. I remember that because I was awake when that happened, within hours of the announcement of Trump's victory. The French government is gone. The South Korean government is in crisis. The Italians and the Austrians already had their reckoning before Trump was elected. Starmer is in trouble, as you yourself mentioned. So across the board, there is huge difficulty. So the extent to which these governments can go on supporting US aims and strategies without paying an electoral cost is very limited. And I would say that if they try to go against that, they will see that politics will spin out of control of mere elections. And I think that this is also something they have to bear in mind. And then the third limit is that essentially the US's own weight and economic weight in the world is declining. So the US, they may say, we are going to impose tariffs, but honestly, threaten me with something else. How threatening is that? Except for Canada and Mexico, which are very deeply integrated into the United States economy, most countries in the world will suffer a nasty shock, but not a shock they cannot recover from. They will recover, and quite frankly, with the existence of China, they will not take a very long time to recover. So, for all of these reasons, I would say that Trump's threats are really not to be taken very seriously. And as far as militarily taking Greenland is concerned, I mean, quite frankly, if you look at military taking any part of the world is concerned, if you look at the US's record, they have not won a single war. If you think about it, they lost in Korea, they lost in Vietnam, they have lost in every war except when it came to overrunning, yeah, Panama, poor Panama, who knows what's going to happen there, and Grenada. But also remember that there are other powers that are now much bigger. The US today cannot easily contemplate attacking even Iran, let alone China or some Russia or some bigger power than that. So basically, these are the parameters. So within that, sorry, can I go on for a couple of minutes longer, or should I stop now? Go on for a couple of minutes longer. So take a look at just tariffs. These tariffs that Trump is threatening. I mean, first of all, the tariffs are just electoral rhetoric. The claim that somehow the tariffs are going to revive the US economy is a complete dream world. Why is it a complete dream world? Because the only thing that will revive the US economy is industrial policy. And what does industrial policy need? It needs a government capable of disciplining capital. If you can't discipline capital, if you can't tell them what they need to do in order to get what from the government, etc., you don't have an industrial policy. What Biden has announced in his 4 signature programs, that everybody, all the intellectuals sympathetic to the Biden administration claim is industrial policy, are nothing but new programs to give more subsidies to these corporations. So that's not going to work. And quite frankly, the other thing I think that a proper industrial policy will need is systematic financial regulation, probably including capital controls, which is a big no-no for the neoliberal establishment and practically every CEO and their house-trained intellectuals that I can think of. Nobody is going to tolerate capital controls, but without that, you really can't have proper industrial policy. Secondly, if these tariffs are imposed, they will increase the already high inflation that's plaguing the US economy. And by the way, we can discuss this later, but to me, this high inflation is already a mark of the decrease in US imperial capacities, because imperial capacities necessarily means that you have the power to compel the rest of the world, particularly the third world, to cough up its goods and services for next to nothing. And it's because this ability is declining that core inflation, not just the prices of volatile food and fuel prices, but core inflation is rising. When economists use the term supply side inflation, they are surreptitiously nodding to this problem. So of course, then thirdly, Trump will be opposed by many US CEOs. I mean, these guys have spent the last 4.5 decades extending long supply lines around the world. Their goods, before being finished, pass borders several times. Now, are they going to pay tariffs each time this unfinished good passes a border before it pays, it comes for sale in the United States or anywhere else for that matter? These tariffs are going to increase costs for all of these, and they will naturally be opposed by all types of capitalists, the Biden variety as well as the Trump variety. And then also, this, as I say, the grandstanding on tariffs is based on the assumption that once the US declares tariffs, everybody in the world is going to shake in their socks. They're not going to do that. Today, the US accounts for only 15.9% of world imports. Like I said, beyond Mexico and Canada, who should, by the way, be rapidly thinking of diversifying their trade strategies, implementing good industrial policies, etc. Unless they do that, they're not going to survive anyway. But nevertheless, barring Mexico and Canada, everybody else is going to be fine. Okay, they got a bad shock, they got thwacked. Fine, they'll get thwacked, but they will recover. So, and you know what? The worst thing is that if Trump implements these policies and these countries turn away from trade with the United States, that will only reduce US power. So that is my analysis of the overall parameters within which we have to understand Trump's threats. They are a lot of noise. Some of them will hurt,
Mhm.
possibly hurt many constituencies badly. Like I could have gone on about deportations. I'm sure a lot of people are going to suffer, but I
Mm.
doubt he's going to be able to deport 11 million people from the United States. That's all. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much. This was a very comprehensive overview of the limitations of US imperialism. It's very good to always hear about the limitations on empire and these kind of contradictions that empire is caught in. It also seems like, as you're saying, that the capacity of the US to destroy seems to exceed its capacity to reconstruct. So it's not the empire of even like the post World War II empire, where it could actually, like, for certain counter revolutionary purposes, give a Marshall Plan out or try to do some kind of reconstruction. Now, what we have is Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya. So it's really a turning from a planet of slums into a planet of ruins. That's the kind of future that the US is offering to the world. And this very neatly brings us to Max and to the Middle East. Um, Max, we've all been extremely disturbed witnessing the genocide for over a year now. The absolute shameless, not just silence of Western governments, but complicity of Western governments. And I think a lot of people are taken aback by the excessive nature of this violence, the surplus nature. Why? What is the military? For example, people ask, what's the military purpose of, like, continuously bombarding a place like Gaza for so long, or of expanding the war to Lebanon, expanding the war to Syria? Would it not have been better for an imperial strategy to just have a limited kind of a war, keep the American public opinion and the Muslim public opinion with empire, if that's even possible, and focus more on the great enemy, which is China or Russia? It seems like we don't have the right theoretical tools to understand this, the meaning of this kind of excessive surplus violence. What does it do for empire? What is the role of this kinds of spectacular violence that now is being televised and is on social media within the political economy of imperialism? Can we connect this to the political economy of imperialism in terms of both the military strategies, but also somehow the necessity for value production, the link between value production and this kind of destruction that we're seeing in the Middle East?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's very important. To begin with, I think that the theories of imperialism, including the very important classical work of Lenin, were always a product of their times, right? And especially as the theories of imperialism were elaborated in the post 1945 period. So one, they were very much elaborated during periods when the U.S. imperialist agenda was one of kind of neo-colonial developmentalism. And therefore, this is to speak differently of the work of Hoferding and Luxemburg and Lenin and so forth. So the point is, they tended to emphasize during this period the productive aspects of imperialism as it was inflected by the developmental moment, without historicizing the developmental moment. I mean, so development on a world scale was only possible because of the existence of the Soviet Union and Maoist China. And Maoist China, of course, was only possible because of the Soviet Union. And this actually essentially made the developmental regime possible on a world scale. And that became an object of class struggle, and an object over relative shares of value within the world system, and whether capitalist development would be more socially embedded or less socially embedded, and so forth. But these were the terms of the game. And I think this kind of often has tended to block from view the colonial origins of imperialism, or kind of to relegate that to a kind of antecedent or interior stage of accumulation on a world scale, rather than thinking about, say, the 1917 to 1921, but really the 1945 to 1991 moment as actually an abnormal period of accumulation on a world scale that was exceptional and outside of the historical norm, rather than something that we should be generalizing from. Rather, we should treat it as something exceptional in that it had a developmentalist cast, right? And that includes, I think, the period of Reconstruction in both Germany and Japan, which obviously occurred was a developmental prophylactic against the expansion of communism. It was a containment operation, right? This is why you had to reconstitute these military and economic blocs around unfriendly and continental scale communist powers, right? So if we go back to the earlier periods of what actually constituted the law of value, what actually constituted the process of accumulation on a world scale, it was actually the ripping apart of social formations, the suppression of per capita food grain access, the disarticulation, and the resetting of developmental levels back to a lower and lower and iteratively lower level. I mean, the work of Utsen Patnaik is foundational on this. The work of Colonial Drain has also been very, very well established. For example, for Indonesia, you had demographic disasters that were unfurling across West Africa. You had half of the population was actually destroyed in Algeria during the settler colonization of Algeria. You had a third of the population that was destroyed in Libya during the savage wars of Italian colonialism in Libya. You had massive demographic degradation in the antipodes, in what's modern day called Australia and the United States, Canada, where you had 90, 95 over that percent of the population was actually leveled as part of accumulation on a world scale. And so so these moments, right, which were kind of never really theorized by Marx, but were much more discussed by Marx, sometimes they were discussed with great clarity and acuity by Marx, tend to be considered, I think, even in a lot of anti-imperialist theory, as antecedent rather than constitutive, and something that happened in the past rather than something that will be happening in the future, because this is kind of the logic of imperialism. This is what Césaire was kind of pointing out more with poetics than with political economy, that this kind of Hitlerism was actually constitutive of European colonialism, right? That Hitler's moment was actually just European colonialism rebounding back. And then, so there's this, if that's kept in mind, it's understood that actually the process of accumulation on a world scale is not only about grabbing absolute quantities of value, it's also saying, okay, these quantities of value need to be grabbing relative shares, relatively larger and larger shares of the social production on a world scale, right? The shares of the product of social labor on a world scale. How do you do that? Well, if it's relative, and not only the absolute is important because people want wealth, but the relative is absolute because wealth is always measured comparatively, right? So if that's understood, I mean, what are you going to do? Then you understand that one, it's the productive or developmentalist aspects. If you say, oh, we want more and we can take a smaller piece of a bigger pie, that's not actually very normal to capitalism. Capitalists would rather be leveling the productive forces of the entire Asian continent, right? And so this is what it can't do it everywhere, but what it does to focus in particular now to come back to the Arab region, it's very normal that it does this, right? It tolerated developmental state capitalisms in Syria and in Egypt because it had to, because the Soviet Union was there. Basically, as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, what happened in Iraq? Iraq was just destroyed. Iraq was practically, millions of people were wiped from the face of the earth. There was an asphyxiating sanctions regimes. Politics itself was basically made illegal in the Arab region. If you were a military force that espoused a politics that was contrary to Israel and the United States interests, you're actually illegal. You're placed on something called the terror lists, which have spread across the United States, which have spread now, are even more severe in England through the prevent legislation, the counter-terror legislation, and they're also being spread across Canada and the European Union and so forth, right? Which actually illegalize any form, not first of material ties with any of a wide variety of anti-systemic movements like Hezbollah, PFLP in the Arab region, but also actually erect political quarantine so that there's no interaction with these forces. So actually, this is novel. Politics itself has been made illegal in the Arab Iranian region in particular, right? As the US carries out also mop up operations or tries to against the National People's Army in the Philippines and other forces, right? FARC, and disarms notably these forces, right? So, but also, I mean, if you look at what happened in Egypt, right? Egypt went from a very varied stages of progressively more unequal forms of highly state-regulated capitalism to a period when rural poverty went basically hit 100%. That is, almost everybody in the countryside was suffering in a state of extreme poverty, starting from 99% onwards. You don't have to do it with bombs that flash in front of our eyes. You can also do it with bombs of neoliberal economics that are actually tantamount to a process of de-development, to take the word of Ali Qadri, right? So this actually become very normative. It's not by any means an exceptional thing that what's happening to Gaza. I mean, it's horrible what's happening to Gaza, but what's happening to Gaza is what happens when various modalities of containment and more low intensity counterinsurgency fail. Okay, if you can't destroy people with neoliberal economics and kind of a soporific of some form of kind of a developmental intravenous feed as they supply through the aid regime in the West Bank that's coexisting also with a lot of repression, then you have to actually wipe people from the face of the earth. So what happened is that and this is also, look at what they did to Syria, right? Syria is very contentious. And actually, I'm tired actually of blaming the US regime for what it did to Syria. I blame the left for what it did to Syria. I blame the left for not saying one word about the destruction of Syria since 2011 onwards, for fear and for giving in to intimidation, and for not saying a word about the Caesar sanctions that unfurled on Syria from 2019 onwards and prevented any rehabilitation of the productive forces of Libya, of Syria, right? This is the left failed on this. You don't blame Hitler for being Hitler. You fight with Hitler, right? You don't blame the U.S. for being the U.S. You fight with the U.S. But the left is actually supposed to be fighting the U.S. and the left was mostly insisting that it wasn't worth it. It was not worth it. Oh, the situation in Syria is very complicated. No, quantum mechanics is complicated. Syria is contentious. Those are not the same. Right. So, but Syria, okay, 500, 600,000 people died, maybe more. Life expectancy went down by a number of years. So if you use other type of tabulations about the number of deaths. So is this, of course, what's happening in Gaza is worse. It's faster. It's more violent. But what Yemen, 600,000 people died or more. No one counts, right? The death counts are now contentious in Palestine because we have a movement mobilized around it, right? But no one even knows that the death counts are contentious in Yemen, right? Because there's an erasure of even knowledge about the reality of the fact that there was a US war routed through Saudi Arabia that actually imposed widespread famine on Yemen and still has a base around Aden, right? I mean, there is still basically what's a US-sponsored military occupation, secessionist regime, right, in a portion of Yemen. There's so-called Al-Qaeda, which is obviously most of these forces are backed by Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, which don't do a thing in this portion of the world without a yellow light, which is the same thing as a green light from the US, right? So all of these forces have been, all these countries that had some form of institutional legacy of Arab republicanism, however degraded and however tarnished, or even tarnished so much that you couldn't even see the light of it underneath anymore, right? All of these wars were precursors to what happened in Gaza. But Gaza was something very different in that you actually had an insurgent force that emerged and didn't just, it didn't have a state as it did in Yemen, but what it did is it attacked, went out and mounted an offensive, not a defensive operation, but an offensive operation against the major appendage of US imperialism in the entire region. So there's kind of this argument that it's irrational. Well, again, like if you go through the history, look at history in this way that I think it's productive to look at history, what the survey I just did, it's not irrational. It's actually very normal to be carrying out this degree of mass death in order to safeguard the scaffolding of accumulation on a world scale, right? That's actually very much the norm. It's not exceptional at all. But secondly, in order to maintain a system of accumulation on a world scale, you have to make sure people aren't resisting that process of accumulation on a world scale. And one, you can either try to buy them. Two, you can try to convince them that what's happening is good, but you can't buy the people in Palestine. In the West Bank, to some extent, it's been possible through the PA, but it hasn't been fully widespread. Second of all, you can convince them that what's happening is okay. You can't convince the people in Gaza who have, just see the sea and see an Israeli warship on the horizon every day of their life that this is okay. So they got organized and they mounted an armed attack that was crossing the armistice lines, because Israel has no border, crossed the armistice lines into occupied 48 Palestine, and was actually destroyed what's called the Israeli deterrence factor, which is another way of saying destroyed the fact that Israel is able to enforce an ideology where its domination is normal. And it said this domination, not only is it not normal, but we can break it, right? And that a force that is motivated by this ideology has to be wiped from the face of the earth. If your motivating force is to wipe that force, wipe the commitment of that force from the face of the earth, then you are going to keep fighting until that is successful, right? So, and it's well known that they haven't done, that they haven't at all wiped Hamas out. I mean, actually, there's the last week, I think, has seen. In the last 2 days, there have been between 10 and 15 Israeli soldiers reported, announced, killed in the north of the Gaza Strip. It's actually one of the most intense period of guerrilla activities in the entire Gaza war over the past month in the north of the Gaza Strip. So this motivating force, which is also a aspiration to reform political apparatuses that can represent sovereignty, including popular sovereignty, in the face of the Israeli-US political engineering, this cannot be allowed, right? So this is why the war continues, right? And if you understand that, in particular, what the US wants in the Arab-Iranian region is it wants only capitalist accumulation under state structures that have been born in alliance with the US. In other words, basically the Khaliji state structures, right? And Morocco, and Jordan, Israel, right? This is what it wants in the Arab-Iranian region. It only wants fully infeudated, fully assimilated state structures that have no memory of Arab republicanism whatsoever, that were actually born as US clients, right? That's who it accepts. They gather together generally a lot of resources under their boot, be it like phosphates or some heavy amount of actually fruit and vegetable production that's very important in Morocco in order for European imperialist social democracy to subsist. And also in the Khalij, of course, you have a raw commodity production that's very important. And the rest, you just make it a wasteland, right? Which actually involves destroying the state structure itself and reconstituting it with NGOs and reconstituting it as sectarian structures that are incapable of articulating an Arab Republican basis that crosses sectarian lines, which is why Syria had to be destroyed too, right? Syria was the last remnant of that. And what you have left is the aspiration or the reality that people can only identify their belonging and therefore their political organization in sectarian lines, right? So this is another way. You've actually hardened and institutionalized the separation of the working class along the lines of sect, right? This is very productive for imperialism. This is what Al Jazeera Arabic and English also do routinely, right? And Al Jazeera English, again, is widely accepted as a kind of credible source of Euro-American and also worldwide left, right? This is actually a problem, right? We need to struggle against our own weaknesses, right? Now, so what's going on now? I mean, the war is continuing because the guerrilla resistance is continuing. There's been very little success in actually permanently destroying the tunnel network. I mean, the tunnel network is damaged because the entrances are damaged, but the length of the tunnel is very, very hard to destroy. They have not successfully penetrated the tunnel system, despite the propaganda. I mean, if you read like dispatches on it that are appearing at like the West Point military disintelligence centers, I mean, they offer like 2 paragraphs. They're like, yes, we know this about the tunnel, we know that about the tunnel. And then they say, okay, well, we're doing our best, basically, right? So they haven't actually managed to dissolve the tunnel system, and they've managed to degrade, some cases disorganize the military resistance in the Gaza Strip, but they haven't actually managed to stop it in any way, shape, or form. If the war stops, what happens? The entire population of the Gaza Strip, correctly, views Israel as a force that exists to destroy them and deny them a future. What are you going to do if this is the force in front of you? You are going to see how to resist that force. It's the most logical thing in the world, right? So of course the war can't stop, right? This is why the war can't stop. And not only that, but it's spreading to the West Bank, right? I mean, Jenin is quite out of control at this point, right? Jenin is very much outside of the control of the Palestinian Authority and Israel and so forth, right? And so this kind of idea that Israel needs to be confronted is spreading rather than diminishing, even though there have been real blows to the unity of fields. There's been real blows to the overall infrastructure. I mean, there's all kinds of vulnerabilities. There's all kinds of setbacks. There's all kinds of defeats. But the overall idea that these forces have that you need to confront the U.S. and Israel with armed force, and this is, of course, backstopped by all sorts of forces who are also heavily sanctioned, including Iran, including, that's never mentioned, North Korea, one of the most important ones that's backstopping it, including, and Iran in turn is backstopped by China and Russia to some extent, right? So the situation is very different with this existence of semi-industrialized or fully industrialized semi-peripheries or emerging powers on a world scale. And this is why the war continues, and this is why this so-called excess occurs. I mean, the excess is actually not excessive at all from the perspective of these people. So I'm gonna stop there.
Well, thank you so much for that very comprehensive overview of what's happening in the Arab world and the close link between this form of imperialist violence and capital accumulation, value accumulation on a world scale. And two things that I find particularly interesting in your presentation is one, the idea that for most of the global South, there will be no universalism left, or no kind of republicanism or socialism, or even if you have some idea of that Islamic, nothing. We will have these particularities, tribal, sectarian, identity-based, that will be competing for the world carved out by the US, which will be a world administered through NGOs. So in a way, what we'll have, the only universal we'll have is universal horror. And the other thing that is very clear is that the one of the most important tasks of this kind of imperialist violence is to create this counter-revolutionary moment of defeat, to make defeat the underlying subjectivity in the global South. And Max, you've written about it as well, how important surrender and defeat is for imperialist powers. And that's where we go to Comrade Joti Brar. There is a moment of, in some ways, a moment of defeat, but in other moments, as both Comrades Radhika and Comrade Max have said, there are very serious limitations to empire. Empire is being resisted. Not everybody is surrendering. In fact, in the longer arc of history, it may be that we are seeing a declining empire. What lessons do we have from our own history? And by our, I mean the history of the communist movement, in terms of comprehending the present moment and also organizing in such a way that we do not make the kinds of mistakes that Max also just pointed out in terms of misunderstanding, misrecognizing the major contradictions, not standing up against empire when it needs to be, and always be, what I think, like this kind of need to be liked by everyone, which is very big on the left, right? So, I mean, that's part of the reason why nobody wants to talk about Syria, because when we talked about Syria, everybody who liked us, they were like, but you are talking about human rights in Pakistan and you're supporting Assad. So this kind of distracting tendency, these weapons of mass distraction that the imperialists have made to discipline us. How do we fight that, and how do we take comfort and lessons from the history of our movement, the communist movement? Yes, Jyoti.
Thank you. Well, I really want to pick up on what Max was saying, because he's really summed up what, for me, at this point in time, is the number one lesson, which is the fall of Syria is not the fault of the Syrian people, the Syrian government, the Russian government, the Iranian government, Hezbollah. Fundamentally, the biggest responsibility lies with the workers in the West who did nothing. And you've put your finger just there in your question on something very important: the disciplining factor of the mass media. The way that people who call themselves left allow their narrative and the things they consider to be acceptable to be said and talked about to be confined within what is acceptable to mainstream bourgeois media. Now, of course, that narrative is constructed precisely to exclude everything that counts for progress for the workers and oppressed peoples of the world. So no genuine anti-imperialist, no genuine revolutionary can allow themselves to be guided by what the mainstream tells you is acceptable in a world where the mainstream is dictated by your class enemies. I mean, that should be ABC, right, for communists. The fact that it isn't shows you that, the rottenness of the communist movement. I've written a kind of broad historical overview about how we got where we are, and I don't propose to go into that right now because it takes a long time. There's a lot of factors. Living in an imperialist country, as I do, I'm very conscious of the fact that my party, which remains small precisely because we say the things that you're not allowed to say, my party was the only force in Britain in the last 20 years that actually tried to bring a genuinely anti-imperialist, anti-war program to the working class. And we were blocked from doing that. We were, in fact, expelled from the anti-war movement because we were trying to do that. Right? We had two slogans that we always bring to every war and have been doing since before our party was founded. One is victory to the resistance. Right? The understanding that the people resisting imperialist war being waged by your own ruling class are right to resist, and they need to win. And workers in the West need to ally themselves with those movements. They need to help work for that victory. They need to support that resistance movement. They need to understand how their struggles are connected. This understanding was brought to us in particular by Lenin, and it is, one of the most important central themes of Leninism for today, I think. This understanding that the war against imperialism is fought on two fronts, and those fronts have to work together. And you can't win the war against imperialism only on the foreign front if you're not also working on the home front. And I think the fall of Syria really underlines that for us. The Syrian people defended themselves amazingly. They withstood an astonishing onslaught for a really long time. Max talked about all the different elements of that onslaught and how over a long period of time, those elements were able to chip away and hollow out the economy of the Syrian people to the point where the state simply didn't have the resilience to cope with one more attack from the imperialist forces occupying its territory. How it was bled dry in so many different ways. But that should never have been allowed to happen. If there'd been a genuinely anti-imperialist, anti-war movement in the Western countries, mobilizing the working class, helping it understand these things. Number one, they have a common enemy and they need to practically side with the resistance forces. What does that mean in practice? That means mobilizing organized labor for a campaign of mass non-cooperation with the war, refusing to cooperate with any aspect of the imperialist war machine in the home country. That doesn't just mean refusing to fight in the army, also means refusing to make and move the munitions and any other materials and expertise that are being sent over to the front. It also means refusing to write or broadcast the propaganda for the wars. The propaganda aspect of these wars is hugely important. And it's something that the working class has to recognize as every other part of the war machine. It doesn't happen without our work and cooperation on every level. The British working class, the working class in all the imperialist countries especially, need a leadership that's prepared to educate them about that and organize. And these demands need to be injected into the working class. The mass rank and file need to be demanding it. And we have a very good precedent in the history of our movement, and in Britain in particular, at the time of the War of Intervention against the early Soviet Russia in 1920. And it's kind of shameful that this is the last time the British working class organized itself in such a phenomenal way, but that is the case. In 1920, when Britain and its war effort was being led by Winston Churchill, who was a young minister at that time for war, and he said, we need to strangle the Bolshevik baby in its crib. And Britain was one of, I think, 14 countries that invaded the Soviet Union to back up the white forces and try and crush the revolution. The British working class, led by a very, very new and young communist movement, organized a huge grassroots campaign called the Hands Off Russia campaign. And it was so successful that it was able to force the TUC, Trade Union Congress leadership, which even then was very reactionary, did not want to make these demands, but the pressure from the grassroots was so strong, it was forced to threaten the government with a general strike. There was a moment where dockers refused to load arms, munitions, and soldiers onto a ship called the Jolly George in the London docks. And that had a huge impact. It kind of electrified the country. The campaign became massive. The TUC had to threaten a general strike, and the government knew it was a real threat and actually had to back down, actually had to pull out of that war of intervention. Now that shows you, number one, in any particular war, of course, you can't stop war while imperialism exists. But in a particular war, in a particular situation, you can stop the ruling class doing what it's doing if you organize yourselves to use the power of the working class en masse, not as individuals. Not as individuals. Our message absolutely has to be that it's mass power that we have, organized power, is what can face down the ruling class and prevent them from carrying out their terrible crimes around the world. We don't have to be passive receivers of information on our phones. We don't have to be commentators of politics as if what's happening in the world is a football game. And we just analyze it and say who won and who lost and whose fault it is. And it's all nothing to do with us. We have no power. We're just individuals with phones. But that's not the case. We are members of a class, and a class has organized power if it learns how to use it. What the problem we have, of course, is that leaderships of the working class across the West, and including, unfortunately, many communist parties, where the parties are big enough, absolutely stay away from bringing this education and understanding and these demands to the workers. But that's absolutely the example and the understanding we need to be resuscitating in this period, that the imperialism, Radhika's right. The general trend of imperialism is downwards right now. There's a terminal decline that's set in. There's a huge economic crisis. You can see the punishment beatings that the imperialists are meting out in the Middle East as a sign of their desperation in their crisis. Alex said, these supply lines around the world, and Radhika, I think as well, they create a great vulnerability. And the whole imperialist system now relies on every hyper-exploited people around the world remaining in their place in the system. They all have to continue to accept total impoverishment and immiseration. They all have to continue sending their goods as cheaply as possible to the workers in the West so that they can continue to live a privileged existence and everything can kind of stay semi-stable, except for it's not stable, even when those things stay in place. Right? There's a deep, deep crisis in their global capitalist economic system, and there's a desperation to find and increase profitability by any means necessary. There's a real opportunity in this coming period, in all of the turmoil and crisis that's going on. There's a real opportunity for imperialism to suffer decisive defeat. All of the factors are there, but what's really lacking is organization and understanding amongst the workers in the West in particular, but also the injection of seriously militant Bolshevik type communist politics into all the anti-imperialist movements everywhere, because it's the Leninist analysis, it's Marxism-Leninism that can give that real ideological steel to the anti-imperialist movement in every country, that enables it to really understand its enemy, to really keep its connection with the masses, which is so important when imperialism is trying to overpower you with so many weapons of so many different types.
Thank you so much, Comrade Jyoti. That lifted our spirits, and we need that. We need more and more of that, more and more organizing, more and more telling the truth, and really looking at both the dangers and the opportunities inherent in the current conjuncture, because both, of course, naturally exist. And I will come back to you. We'll have a round of questions, and I would want to know a bit more about what you are doing at the moment and your party is doing at the moment in terms of organizing. You did mention it a little, but I'll go first to my friend and comrade Ziad. Ziad, I was wondering if you could maybe comment a little on the overall discussion, and I'll give you a chance to have do a round of questions as well to all our three speakers. Yeah.
Thank you. I would say that my comments would actually sort of lead into a question to all of our three friends here, and very briefly, because I think in a way what each of them says, of course, ties into the theme of anti-imperialism in general and the context of the current moment. So there is obviously a continuity in terms of the counter-revolutionary violence that we see the US and its partners, meting out, say, in the Middle East and North Africa region. What interests me and what I hope also, I mean, among the many things that interest me from our discussion, I was hoping that our friends could comment perhaps as well a bit more, because I imagine that they would have much to say about this. We've seen the somewhat dispiriting effects of counter-revolutionary violence in Palestine, in Lebanon. They're making plans to hit Yemen hard, and so on and so forth. So this is a dynamic that those of us who have a slight idea of colonial history are well acquainted with. The prospect of military resistance to imperialism, and then what's done to crush it. As Max mentioned also, that the developmentalism was never really part of the script, if I understood correctly, for imperialism, and there was more of an aberration, if anything, in those phases, perhaps where developmentalism became a thing on the global sort of agenda, under the capitalist world system. So we have something extraordinary that happened in terms of China's sort of economic challenge to imperialism and to empire, because we're much more accustomed to military challenges. That is something that all of us are much more accustomed to, intellectually, perhaps, psychologically, spiritually, in every way. But something happened which was not supposed to happen, where China began to pose an economic challenge of a scale that perhaps empire did not imagine coming. They were more accustomed, even from the Soviet Union, from a more, let's say, conventional military strategic challenge, especially after the 1960s, when let's say Soviet technology and industry perhaps wasn't exactly keeping up with Western industry. But China is able to fight back in domains that were unimaginable for any previous socialist powers, right? To our three friends, I would hope that perhaps each of you could comment on this. Uh, do you think that the changed conditions that we have now with the economic rise of China, without it being tamed uh, by capitalism, imperialism, should this require us to update? As Max said, Lenin's work on imperialism as well was, of course, a seminal work, but ultimately addressing the situation and the questions of its time. So to what extent do we need to update our understanding of imperialism and anti-imperialism in particular in the context of such a powerful economic, perhaps, defiance as well of capitalism, imperialism? If you could.
Yeah. Thank you, Ziad. Radhika is facing a power outage in Bangalore, which is a quintessential South Asian experience. So we'll go to Max in terms of the comparison between the economic challenges that the U.S. faced from the Soviet Union and now from China. If you have, and also what is the nature of the relationship between development and anti-colonialism more broadly in terms of what kind of a challenge, and particularly China's development, poses to U.S. hegemony and imperialist hegemony. And then we'll come to you, Jyoti, and then we'll go to Comrade Radhika.
I mean, China, which also had a questionable foreign policy often under Mao, and made a great deal of mistakes that should not be sidestepped. Also, is not interested in challenging the U.S. very much in terms of confrontations. It's interested in peaceful growth in the development of the productive forces. It's not interested in income deflation. It's not interested in sanctions. It's not interested in hot wars that conduce to income deflation. It's also not interested in ameliorating processes of unequal exchange with Latin America or its Asian neighbors or Africa. So, the way is open for social struggles in the periphery to change their terms of trade with China and leverage the capital they can access to improve their productive forces. I mean, I think it can certainly happen, but the struggle is coming from there, and it's coming in a moment where there's both a set of lights and a set of shadows. I mean, the shadows are that communism is not a hegemonic force in the periphery, or at least a dominant vocabulary of opposition in the third world or the periphery of the world system, as it was during the latter half of the Soviet period. I mean, and this is because the Soviets didn't hold open development space because of their GDP size. They held it open because they had a motivating ideology that furthermore meant a lot to a lot of people, was associated with anti-colonialism and anti-colonial struggles, and finally actually was supporting all sorts of economic, of intellectual and cultural projects in the periphery, right? That isn't happening with China, right? So this is the situation is not the same. The difference is the productive forces on a world scale are much more advanced, and the amount of industrialization. I mean, China is about to has broken through almost every single technological monopoly. I mean, basically what remains is like aircraft, right? I mean, practically every other technological monopoly, which is actually central to the core's power, is now relatively more distributed, which means that perhaps if there are struggles to change terms of trade and incorporate technology transfer into trade with the rest of the periphery, that opportunities are more open, whereas this was basically almost never permitted by the U.S., right? I mean, maintained it was critical to the U.S. to maintain it. So, and also to just decapitate and extirpate any force that actually tried to put such things on the agenda within the periphery of the world system, a type of political engineering that China doesn't engage in. So, I think the way is open, but the struggle has to come from, and China is not interested in that struggle. I mean, China's still trading with Israel. So, they're building up their productive forces in their way, and what has to be done is outside of China, I think.
Thank you, Max.
I guess I think it's discrediting to some extent, in a good way, the U.S. hegemony on a world scale, and I think it's bloodying its nose. And I think this itself does also finally have potential anti-systemic impacts, in the sense that the hegemony or the dominance both rest on the idea that any challenge will be destroyed, and China is challenging that notion. So I think that's also productive.
And to take it from your last bit, I mean, the fact that the U.S. is going a bit insane in Asia in terms of building the military bases, in terms of, I mean, we're experiencing that in Pakistan. They're like going insane about ensuring that China is kept out of the country. And also, I mean, just the rhetoric of both center and right wing and even liberal circles across the West. This time in the US, when I was visiting, I mean, the kind of China phobia, xenophobia that I witnessed was very alarming. So there is some kind of a tension that's emerging, and there's a military aspect to it as well. But I'll take it to Jyoti, comrade, if you could also comment on the role or the place of China in the anti-imperialist imagination at the moment.
Sure. Just thinking about the question, how does our perception of imperialism change with the changing times? It's very interesting when you read Lenin's Imperialism. Of course, it was written in 1916. And then in 1917, everything changed. Right? A new force came into the world, and a new era was opened in history. The era of socialism is the era we live in. Since the beginning of the Soviet Union, since the Russian Revolution of October 1917, that is the era that was opened. And so the whole equation for imperialism since then has been a different one. They haven't only had to be fighting with one another over who controls the world, they've been having to face this threat of the death of all of them in the face of the rising tide of the working class and the oppressed peoples. And it's not an accident that the national liberation consciousness and technical abilities spread around the world massively in the wake of the October Revolution, and then again on another wave in the wake of the victory of the Soviet Union over the fascists in World War II, right? So, of course, we are living in a different world. We have been in a different world for more than 100 years now. And yet, particularly if you live in an imperialist country and you read Lenin on imperialism, so much of it sounds like he's describing today, only today it's more so because we've had 100 more years of the advancing senility of capitalism, of the incredible concentration of wealth, right? That process has continued, ever since 1917. It's still been happening, right? In the places where it can be happening, and all the contradictions that go alongside that phenomenal concentration of wealth have also been growing. The capitalist imperialist system was in a deep crisis in the 1980s. The fall of the Soviet Union gave the whole global system a shot in the arm in terms of its ability to loot and restore profitability in some kind of a way. But attacks on the working class, which had begun at the end of the post-war boom, beginning in the 1970s in the West, they never stopped. They've been getting worse and worse. And of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union, they went up another level because the ideological threat, the sense in people's minds that there's no alternative to this was very, very strong. And around the world, of course, we saw in the 1990s a whole loss not only of positions in the socialist camp, but around the world in the oppressed countries, national liberation struggles, having to kind of cede ground or make very difficult compromises with a decisively shifted balance of class forces at that moment, a very triumphal, very dominant, a very aggressive imperialist camp. But now with a crisis reasserting itself, the imperialists are in very, very deep trouble again. And what you said there, Comrade, about the technological dominance being lost, I think that's an absolutely crucial factor. If you look at the history of colonialism, how was it possible for the capitalist powers of Europe, primarily Britain and then followed by the others, to just walk in wherever they wanted and take whatever they saw? So we'll have this land, and essentially to perceive most of the world as being unoccupied. It was huge technological dominance. And of course, the technological dominance meant also, military dominance, right? The dominance of military technology. You know, if the people facing you have spears and you have machine guns, you don't even have to call it a war, you know, when you gun them down and take their country and occupy it. And those people will accept that there's something sort of natural in that situation. It doesn't mean they'll lie down forever and never rebel, but there's a sort of sense that there's not very much we can do about this, right? When you've got spears and people come with machine guns, it takes quite a long time for people to start to see the weaknesses in their occupiers and settlers and colonizers and start to think about ways to organize against that. We live in a very different world now when it comes to all of those calculations. As Max said, there's not one area of technological advance in which the imperialists are now dominant. Not one that's really important. The one weapon, and I saw a very interesting article from Brian Beletic recently that I think is very important. He talked about how the one big weapon that the imperialists still have and are rolling out constantly around the world is their regime change machinery. And it involves, you know, this spending money essentially to create and buy soft power, you know, non-state institutions everywhere, to infiltrate academia, you know, with pro-Western ideology and to give careers to the right kind of people, you know, across academia, across politics, across the media, and of course it's dominance of the media space. And he talked about the fact that only Russia and China, and I guess the DPRK as well, have been able to create sovereign information spaces for their countries, and how important that is in terms of keeping your people on board with a national anti-imperialist project. How hard it is to fight off, you know, all the tentacles of imperialist money when they come through everybody's mobile phone, you know, 24 hours a day. And I think that's something, you know, that other countries, I think Brian was right when he said other countries need to take cognizance of this in this, the world we're in now, that, okay, the imperialists are less and less able, and Radhika's right, they haven't won a war really since the Second World War, apart from Yugoslavia and a couple of, you know, small Latin American countries, Caribbean countries, they were able to overrun. But essentially, the wars militarily, when they can flatten a country, they can ruin its infrastructure, they can destroy the lives of its people. When they put boots on the ground, they cannot halt. And the reason for that, of course, is what I said in the beginning of my contribution. We are living in the era of socialism, and that means that national liberation consciousness is the dominant consciousness of the people of the world. And if you actually try to go in and forcibly hold them down, they will fight back. You know, we always say when we look at the Zionist colony that it was a colony that was established after the era of colonizations. There was never going to be the possibility that Israel could be stable and could last into any kind of long term, because it arrived in a moment where the colonized already had national liberation ideologies. And, you know, the Palestinians never took the path that was expected of them, that, well, they're just Arabs and they'll just dissolve themselves into the, rest of the Arab population in other countries, and, it's not really going to be a problem. We'll scare them. The Nakba was supposed to be a kind of terrorizing operation that makes them realize they better bugger off, and that was supposed to be it. Right? That there was no calculus. This is the one thing that imperialism never manages to do, is take into account the thinking and the actions and the abilities of the oppressed. The reason being, of course, that they, by their nature, have to be supremacist and can't really allow themselves to imagine that the masses of humanity as thinking and active human beings able to shape their own destinies.
Well, thank you so much, Comrade Jyoti, and I'll take the same question to Comrade Radhika, who's back now with us after a brief power outage. So the question, you might have heard Comrade Ziad talk about the question of China, or broadly speaking, the question of development in the global South. What in your, and I know you've written a lot on it and you've spoken a lot on it, but we'd still like you to go deeper into this question, because Max pointed out that there can be elements of development in the global South that actually are not anti-systemic. They could be integrated into the system, and he gave a few examples of China's relationship with neighboring countries, with African countries, its continuing trade with Israel. And then Comrade Jyoti, of course, gave another perspective as well, which is that the fact that a certain Asian country or a country on the periphery now is matching the technological might of the West is kind of an historical event in terms of thinking about a world beyond empire. Where do you stand in this discussion on the systemic or anti-systemic potential of China?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a very complex set of questions. So I'll just begin with a couple of fundamental points that I believe, and I think that you'll probably, and most people will agree with them, but we often don't think about them. When we think of anti-imperialism, I think, as I was saying in my opening remarks, we tend to think of, military confrontations like the Vietnam War and various wars of liberation and so on in Angola and whatever. Point is that these wars are, of course, absolutely necessary. It's absolutely necessary to fight them and to win them, but they are not ends in themselves. The purpose of fighting this war is to clear the space for development. Russia itself, Jyoti gave a wonderful example, reminding us of the Russian Revolution in both her interventions, and I think she's absolutely right. The Russian Revolution changed the world. It transformed, and I've also tried to show that we have to think of the Russian Revolution as, in some ways, of course, it was socialist, but in some ways, kind of internal to the history of capitalism, because in a certain sense, Russia and all the territories that became the Soviet Union could not continue a viable existence in the context of imperialism, which they had to fight. So in that sense, it was part of the history of capitalism, that capitalism itself elicits this sort of resistance. But as I say, the purpose of the initial military confrontations is to win them and then clear the space for exactly the sort of economic policy that will be needed for development, which is not the economic policy that is recommended by the imperialist countries, which is free market and free trade. Free market and free trade is essentially a set of imperialist policies. Neoliberalism is essentially an imperialist policy designed to open up the rest of the world, the world outside the imperial heartlands, to penetration by the corporations and the capital of the first world, so that these territories may serve the corporations and the capital of the first world in at least 4 ways, which I can divide into 2 sets, and also say that, those 4 ways are actually contradictory. So in a certain sense, what imperialism wants from the world it cannot really have, because it wants two sets of things that are contradictory to one another. What do I mean by that? The first thing I mean by that is that on the one hand, the first two sets of things they want is they want markets because they constantly produce excess commodities, and they want outlets, investment outlets, because they constantly produce excess capital. So these two things require these territories to be reasonably prosperous. But then they want two other things, which require those territories to be abjectly poor. What are those two things? To be able to acquire the resources of these countries at throwaway prices or more or less zero cost, and to acquire the labor of these countries. And I emphasize that because, so much of the discourse of immigration in Western countries is all about how we must be kind to them and let them in because, we should support them and we should be, universalist and accept human rights and blah, blah. All of this is a lot of claptrap. These countries cannot do without the labor that comes from the third world countries. That's why you got slavery. That's why you got indentured labor. That's why you have the proliferation of temporary workers programs. They can't do without this labor. They have to have this labor. And but at the same time, and in order to keep discipline this labor, they keep up a high decibel anti-immigrant rhetoric so that the incoming labor will be divided from the already existing labor in the country, no matter where it came from, because they too were immigrants. If you allow me, I'll just take a minute to say another thing which I think is very important. I've read Capital several times now, and every time I read the volume 1, chapter 25 is a grandly entitled The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. And you might think it would be full of equations about how much capital goes in, how many products it produces. But if you read that chapter, what is it about? It's about people. It's about population. It's about labor. And so and what, if you read it carefully, what that tells you is, this is a paraphrase of Barrington Moore's argument about capitalism and the bourgeoisie, no middle class, no revolution, something like that. My paraphrase of that is no immigration, no capitalism. No migration, no capitalism. Why? Because capitalism is a crazy system. When it is on the upswing, it sucks in labor from everywhere. It just wants more and more labor. Give me more hands, give me more hands, give me more people. So it sucks in labor. And then when it's on a downswing, it spits this labor out and says, go away where you came from. We don't want to see you, etc. So labor is just as important. But anyway, come back to my main point. So it wants these two sets of contradictory things, one requiring these societies to be prosperous, the other set requiring these societies to be abjectly poor. It can't have both. Now, at the present moment, we are in the phase when anyway, at the present moment, the emphasis is definitely on the latter. They want these societies to be abjectly poor because, quite frankly, they are on the downswing. They're not even expanding so much production. All they want is for whatever little they are doing to get access to cheap labor and cheap commodities, etc., etc. Anyway, so this is imperialism. Imperialism wants these two different things. And that's why it wants to open up economies. Now, the key way to resist that is to do development. And I would say that the first country that developed against the grain of obviously the first countries to actually do this were other capitalist countries, Germany, Japan being excellent examples. But the first non-core country to do this was, of course, the Soviet Union. And I would like to say, we have been, since 1991, the idea that socialism was created a basket case economy has been so deeply ingrained in us. We forget that in the 1950s, prominent economists, including bourgeois economists, were worried about how the Soviet Union was creating parity, effective parity with the rest of the world. Maybe the Soviet citizens lived at a slightly less a good standard of living, but more of them lived a good standard of living than in the capitalist countries. And they did it without imperialism. So, you take all these things into account. The Soviet economic achievement was pretty massive. And the Soviets weren't technological laggards either. Not only did they get the bomb within 4 years, which nobody expected, but they also managed to achieve space technologies, the Sputnik moment, don't forget, which all it induced the Americans into doing is to go into the stunt of this idiotic moon landing. I'm sorry. Of course, people are still want to go to the moon and China is going to go to the moon. But quite frankly, it wasn't half as important as putting a satellite into space. Today, the space sphere is crowded with satellites. It was so important. So technologically, the Soviets were actually leading the charge. I'll say one other thing. I was just talking to some friends about planning and so on. It was an irony of the greatest order that the Soviet Union collapsed just before cyber technology, which would have solved the most massive problems of planning that the Soviet Union had, simply because it made information processing so easy. Before these breakthroughs, just before the breakthroughs, the Soviet Union essentially collapsed. And this is even more ironic if you consider the fact that some of the earliest advances in cyber technology were actually Soviet advances. And the reason they made them is precisely because for them, solving the process of information processing was a real world problem. They faced it every day. Their planners faced it every day. So that's what they were trying to solve. Anyway, so I just want to bring that in. The Soviet Union's economic achievement was no mean achievement. And if today Russia is still a more prosperous society in per capita income terms than China is, it is directly a result of that. So I think we have to remember that. Now, you're saying that China is focusing only on economic development. But I think that if you take these points into consideration, you wouldn't think it's such a bad thing. Yes, of course, China has made foreign policy mistakes, but China has had to make some of these compromises in order to ensure its survival. And I wouldn't blame them. The Soviet Union is often blamed for entering into treaties with Nazi Germany and whatnot. For the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany was just one evil among many. And it tried to very hard to make a deal with the more liberal powers, but only when they decided not to cooperate with the Soviet Union, it made these compromises. So I think we have to keep, and would we wish that the leadership of the Soviet Union would have said, well, in order to keep up with some liberal principle, we are going to sacrifice the achievement of the revolution? Of course, they were not going to do that. That achievement was hard won and it had to be fought for. So anyway, I just want to say that, this is all, and again, another thing, I just would like to say, both in the case of China and the Soviet Union, people point to the famines, the formative famines, the 30s famine in the Soviet Union, the late 50s famine. I put it in quotation marks. It was a period of hardship, but highly exaggerated in the Western literature. If you read Utsa Patnaik's excellent little article in the Monthly Review Online website on the alleged 30 million deaths in China in the Great Great Leap Forward period, you will see it is completely exaggerated. But nevertheless, I just want to come back to that. What were these famines about? These famines were about a very important problem which we never discuss. In order to industrialize without imperialism, you have to transform your agriculture. You have to enable your agriculture to become more productive so that it can feed the people engaged in agriculture as well as millions more besides, that it can do this with less labor than it had previously, that it can also produce all sorts of raw materials that industry requires. This is a massive transformation that is required. Britain didn't have to do it. When Britain needed cotton, it had slave-owning countries to provide it with cotton. When Britain needed food, it had Eastern Europe providing it with cheap wheat. All sorts of this stuff was going on. In countries like the Soviet Union and China, agriculture had to be transformed. And there were mistakes. Nobody's going to say that there were no mistakes, but these were mistakes. They were not deliberate policy choices. And they were rectified as soon as they were discovered, unlike what happens today in capitalist countries where people are starving in amidst plenty, etc., etc. So I would say that, in order to understand the economic achievements of the Soviet Union back then of China today, I think it's important to bear that in mind. And so, to make a very long story short, I think that an emphasis on economic development is absolutely critical. I think that China may be faulted. China and Russia, for that matter, also have a very simple position. The point about the Israel war is not who is supplying Israel with a coal or with whatever what it is. It's the simple fact that the United States can stop this war tomorrow by simply stopping the supply of arms to Israel. It is the chief culprit. The point is not to create unnecessary difficulties for ordinary Israelis, even, which are also human beings. The point is to stop the war. And this is what the United States needs to do. So that is another problem. And they have been exerting pressure as much as they can on stopping the war in Gaza and so on. Okay, so the economic development is critically important, and China is engaging more in the process of not just strengthening itself, but strengthening a heck of a lot of other countries by giving them alternative trade relationships, alternative investment sources, and so on, in order to create wider development. That is the whole purpose of China's overseas engagement. And I would say that in the long run will have greater anti-imperialist impact than simply, say, supporting Syria or what have you. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The nucleus, all these liberal historians who are like the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those are mistakes. And what happened in China in the 50s were crimes, right? So America can never commit a crime. There are always mistakes. Vietnam War was a mistake. Iraq was a mistake. But any leftist government that does anything, even a slight kind of an economic issue, and those are like massive crimes. So there is that absolute bias. Comrade Jyoti, you wanted to say something.
Yes, one small thing, but if I may, I'm just going to quickly comment on the last point of Radhika's as well about those famines, because the other thing that is never talked about in relation to those famines is that in both pre-revolutionary Russia and pre-revolutionary China, famine was a regular part of the existence of the life of the peasantry. It was something that plagued them, and they lost their children to it generation after generation. The famines, so-called, that they describe in revolutionary China and revolutionary Russia were in fact the time when famine was put an end to. Famine was abolished in those countries precisely because of the measures that Radhika was talking about, the fact that the socialist society increased the productivity of agriculture humongously. And in terms of the Soviet Union famine, I mean, I think Radhika's right that in China, the famine from 1960-61, I think it was, which was the last ever famine in China until today, was hugely exaggerated, but it's uncontested that there was some famine that year. There was a lot of drought also that year, right? But the one in Soviet Union and in Ukraine in the 1930s, this is basically a propaganda construct. There was an attempt to create a famine by the peasant capitalists who wanted to obstruct the process of collectivization of agriculture. And they tried to hold the country to ransom. They were burning crops, killing their own livestock, trying to stop food being produced and sent to the cities, trying to create a famine in order that they could blackmail the country and disrupt the development of socialism. But just quickly on the point I just wanted to come back on, very briefly, I can't remember who it was who said that China doesn't want confrontation. It's not interested in confrontation. That is absolutely true. China has made it very clear that it is not interested in provoking any confrontation. But it has also made it very clear that it wants sovereignty and will defend its sovereignty. Now, as far as the imperial is concerned, it's sovereignty which is the crime. doesn't matter what your social system is, as we've seen in so many cases. It doesn't, matter whatever else you're up to. It's really you accept your position as a slave under our domination, or we will be coming for you. So without provoking or looking for confrontation, China, while imperialism exists, is always going to be threatened with confrontation. And it's very, very clear that with all of the war drive that's happening, the ultimate target of that war drive is China, which is exactly why we've seen China make such huge preparations. I mean, you can't say that, China doesn't want confrontation. It's not taking a pacifist stance, is it? It's not disarming and saying, no, don't attack us. We're not going to hurt anybody. It's recognizing that this drive to war is heading in its direction, and it's showing its willingness to defend its sovereignty, its territory, its people, its system. And, much as we all hope it doesn't come to that, the likelihood is it is going to come to that. And China's made it very clear that if war is forced on it, it's preparing to defend itself.
Thank you. I think we need another entire episode just on China and imperialism, because that always comes up as a major issue. I think we will have a longer discussion on that. And if any of the speakers don't want to intervene, I think we've had a very, very rich conversation, and there can be so many conversations that will come out of this conversation, I hope. But some of the things that I think were very clear was that not only is imperialism in decline, but there is a method to its madness, a method to its violence, which is excessive, which is punishing. And not only does it use direct military force, but there's also an entire architecture of counter-revolution that engages in regime change operations. And that fundamental fact of imperialism as being against, standing against the global south, against the people, against the resources, against the sovereignty of the popular classes in the global south, is a fact that should be our point of departure to construct any kind of left politics in the given moment, in the current conjuncture. And one of the disappointments that we have from certain sections of the left, not anyone who's here today, is that many on the left hesitate in taking positions, very clear-cut positions against empire, particularly when issues of human rights or democracy are weaponized by imperialists who are at this point facilitating a genocide. It's a joke that they use these terms. And I mean, right now in the Muslim world, the biggest propaganda thing for the US is that the US is very concerned about Muslims in Xinjiang. And we'll talk about it at some point, that Joe Biden cannot sleep because there are Muslims in some part in China who are not being allowed to go to the mosque or pray. The same guy who's destroyed Libya, who's destroyed Iraq, who's destroyed Syria, who's ravaged Gaza. So I think this kind of hypocrisy everybody is clear on and should be the starting point. In terms of the anti-systemic politics that needs to be built, I think there are a number of levels at which one will have to operate, which one is the military, the other is political organization when you don't have state power, and then one is the logic of state power that Radhika and Jyoti just also described, in terms of kind of these compromises that are part of that larger project of building sovereign state power. How does that state power engage with popular grassroots movements in the Arab world, in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa? That is something that will have to be negotiated, and which is why we need these discussions more and more. But at this point, I would just like to thank all my speakers and my comrade Ziad for being here. This was absolutely, fascinating, the insights that we received today. And I really hope that you guys keep on coming to Red Star as regular guests. I would keep bothering. I know you all are very, very busy people, but we'll be persistent, and Pavel will play a big role in that. And for those watching, thank you so much. We'll come up with another episode next week on Red Star. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.